Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is the Federal Farmer. In fact, we are going to summarize all 13 observations, aka Anti-Federalist Papers, that were written by the Federal Farmer during the ratification debates. Now, I have done videos on each individual paper leading up to this point, so if any of them interest you and you want to learn more, feel free to go back either here on YouTube or founderoftheday.com where I've written articles about each one. But let's get into it. I am going to blow through it pretty quick because, as I said, I've already done them in detail, but this is a nice summary for anyone just trying to get an overview. So in the first paper, Federal Farmer number 1, the farmer gives an overview of the important process of ratification. He asks not to be hasty with this decision. It is a very important one, and he kind of questions what the rush is. He actually goes on then to question the motives of some of the people at the Constitutional Convention, specifically Pennsylvania. He doesn't love Pennsylvania, so it seems, despite probably about 90% probably being from New York himself. In the second Federal Farmer, he presents a really long list of why the Constitution, in his opinion, was doomed to fail. It includes a whole bunch of stuff, notably the distance of the capital from the people themselves, federal courts being inaccessible to anyone who's accused of a crime, the lack of a Bill of Rights, and the fear that the government will need to use force to compel compliance to its rules instead of being persuasive enough to have the people voluntarily comply. Federal Farmer number 3 is really one of the most important ones. Again, I'm summarizing these a lot, but in number 3, the Federal Farmer demonstrates the Constitution has significantly less representation than the state governments. For example, without the federal government, each different state had like 100 or 200 representatives in the assembly. But with the federal government, especially that first federal government, that was shrinking down to like 33 people, and that is a lot less representatives from his particular perspective. He also attacks the Senate for a bunch of reasons. He notes that equal representation wasn't created because it was the best form of government. It's because the small states were throwing a fit and a compromise was needed. And he says that's a really bad omen for starting a government. When you're not creating the best possible republic, you are creating one that everyone's going to compromise to agree on. He also then points out to the idea that taxation and military power will be left up to the government. And at the time, with the inaugural government, with only, I think it was 33 senators and a handful of, it's 26 senators and 33 members of the House of Representatives, that to get a majority, you only need the president, 8 senators, and 17 representatives. So 26 people could control all of the taxes for 3 or 4 million people and all of the army to enforce those rules, which he saw as not great. He also reviews a bunch of problems with the judicial system. It's a really long list. These papers are fairly long. What's interesting, though, is almost everything he outlines in the part about the judicial system is remedied a few years later when the Bill of Rights is passed with the 4th and 5th Amendment. Fair and speedy trial, search without seizure, a local trial, things of that nature. He outlines all of that, which was not in the original Constitution. That's why we have the Bill of Rights, because of the Anti-Federalists to a very large degree. Federal Farmer number 4, he's actually reacting to James Wilson's State House Yard speech. James Wilson, seeing these Anti-Federalists coming out against the Constitution that he helped write, he gives a little speech saying that everything is very clearly defined in the Constitution. Now, while James Wilson was one of the best legal minds of his time, the Federal Farmer points out, no, there are a bunch of things that aren't specifically clear. If taxes will be collected directly, taxes are to be apportioned among the states, but will they be collected directly from the states or directly from individuals? That's not clear. He's also unhappy that in the part about appointing officers for the executive branch, they use the word such exceptions as the Congress will see fit, which he thinks is very vague and not very defined. What would Congress see fit? What are these exceptions? Please specify. In Federal Farmer number 5, the farmer concludes that, he concludes his first set of observations. So the first 5 observations were written in the fall of 1787, and then he takes a break and realizes he made a bunch of money because people liked it, so he writes a bunch more the following January. And in this final of the first section, he basically resigns himself to losing the argument, and he puts out a plea to the ratification conventions not to reject the Constitution, but instead to approve it on the condition that certain amendments will be made once the government begins to meet. Now, this is actually unconstitutional. This is not part of the ratification process according to the Constitution itself, which I know is a little convoluted, but he says do it anyway. And that would put the pressure on the initial representatives and senators to get it done. Moving on to his second set of papers, which are lengthier and not quite as important politically, but should not be ignored. Federal Farmer number 6, he denounces pretend Federalists. And there are two types of people he considers Federalists. Well, to be fair, what most Anti-Federalists considered themselves were Federalists. Most Anti-Federalists wanted a federal government or a confederation of states. Now, he accused these pretend Federalists of being on either side of the Anti-Federalists. The people who called themselves Federalists, he accused as essentially nationalists, and he called them pretend Federalists because they don't want a federal government. They want one national government. Calling themselves Federalists is deceiving. On the other end of the spectrum, there were people who didn't even want a consolidated government. A confederated government. There were people out there who just wanted the state governments. No union at all. He also called them pretend Federalists because, from his perspective, they were pretending to be the Anti-Federalists who were the real Federalists. I know it's a lot of wordplay and it sounds like I'm jumbling. I'm not. That's actually how it went. So that is number 6. In Federal Farmer number 7, the Federal Farmer argues that if the people don't voluntarily comply with the government, then the presidents will have to use force to ensure obedience, which is kind of a reflection off the first Federal Farmer. He does a little bit of repeating throughout these papers. Really, his argument is that you want to create a government that people like enough to support. Because if the people don't support the federal government, which he doesn't think the people are going to support this government in very short order, well, then the federal government's going to have to take out their big guns and force the people to support it, which is basically what happens not just in the Whiskey Rebellion shortly after the Constitution, but in Fry's Rebellion under the Adams administration. Federal Farmer number 8, and again, I'll remind you, I am really briefing these down. These are very long papers that I am just pulling the core juice out of for your very brief enjoyment. Federal Farmer number 8. The Federal Farmer demonstrates why the British government is a bad model to base the Constitution off of. So this is going to sound crazy, but this Anti-Federalist argues about the benefits of nobility. See, in the British government, you have the monarch, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. The House of Lords is made up of aristocracy. They're made up of noblemen. Officially, the government recognizes them as better people. They are noblemen. But the House of Lords is for, the House of Commons is for regular people, which means a nobleman cannot be in the House of Commons, which means the House of Commons is made up of people closer to the common. Yeah, sure, they're usually wealthier common people, but they are, in fact, common people and more attached to them than they are to the nobility, because the nobility is specifically excluding them. Unfortunately, in the United States, basing our model of the Senate and House of Representatives off the British model, there really is no difference between someone who might be in the Senate and someone who might be in the House of Representatives. They're probably all coming from the same class of political and economic elite. And that will take power from the people themselves. And he argues on several occasions that the House of Representatives should be mechanics, it should be physicians, it should be artisans, it should be regular people. It should not be wealthy lawyers. It should not be the top tier of American society. That's not the point. Moving on to Federal Farmer number 9. The farmer discusses the types of politicians and why drastically increasing the number of congressmen will dilute the power of each individual. Let me explain. He says there are 3 types of politicians. Essentially, the wealthy elite, which naturally arise, quick-tongued tricksters, who are not the natural elite, but talk the people into believing they are anyway, and really good, upstanding citizens who deserve to lead. He says the first two probably won't be very good leaders and will try and take power for themselves. The people who actually deserve to lead generally don't get the chance. While they might have opportunities at the local level, maybe even the state level, they never will have the renown within their communities to be elected at the federal level. Additionally, they have jobs to do. They're regular people, so they can't necessarily abandon all of their life to try and run and help the federal government. Now, what he recommends doing is drastically increasing the number of people in the House of Representatives, because if there's more people in the House of Representatives, then each individual congressperson has less power, and therefore corrupt people and wealthy people won't really want those positions because they're not going to be able to corrupt them or gain more wealth from them. They will look for the Senate and the presidency, apparently, is the argument here. But instead, it will open up the opportunity for the people who actually should run because they are good people who deserve to help lead the nation, will find themselves in those positions. Federal Farmer number 10. The farmer suggests that a truly federal system of government would give more power to the states. He counters the Federalist argument that the Constitution only permits the national government to do a few specific things by pointing to the military and taxation. Let me explain that again. Again, like he said before, the federal government, the people calling themselves Federalists aren't. They want a national government. The Anti-Federalists are the real Federalists, and that's why they support giving more power to the states and less power to the federal government. At the time, many Federalists were arguing, well, sure, the federal government has a lot of power, but only does a few specific things. The states have all this other stuff to do. Most of the stuff is left up to the states. And the farmer responds with, sure, but the few things the federal government has to do is tax everyone and protect or suppress everyone with the military. And he literally uses the line, quote, the power to, quote, mend fences isn't necessarily as important as the power to run the military and tax everyone, though the state has lots of fence mending type things to do, sure. Federal Farmer number 11. The farmer submits the belief that the senators will be comfortable in their lengthy terms of office and slowly begin using their power to enrich themselves and their friends. There's not much more to say about that. He thinks the senators, there's only a few of them. They are going to be the most powerful people politically in the nation. And because they're in office for 6 years at a time and appointed by their states, they are just going to be comfortable. They're not going to worry about their jobs, and they're going to be so physically distant and financially distant from the people and not need elections from the people that they will just kind of forget they owe anything to the citizens. And that will not be great. Federal Farmer number 12, he turns his attention to the election process by recommending official districts. Now, today most of us vote, I believe every state votes in districts, but that's not in the Constitution. And he was a little nervous that the states would make up a district where everyone's in one district. And if you live in, I don't know, California, you have to go all the way down to Los Angeles to vote. Granted, he didn't care about California. I'll use New York as an example. That's where I live. Everyone's going to vote in New York City. So if you live up outside Syracuse, well, if you want to vote, you have to travel by horse and buggy a couple 100 miles just to submit your vote. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that's not the case. At least the original Constitution as it was presented. He didn't like that. Additionally, with elections, he asks, who really controls voting regulations? It says in the Constitution that polling places and the manner by which voting is used is set up for the states, except the federal government can step in whenever they see fit. And his question was, well, are they just going to always see it fit to step in and change things around and make it harder for people to vote and control who wins the election? That was his question, not mine. And finally, Federal Farmer number 13. The farmer closes out his observations by attacking the idea of federal districts. So Washington, D.C. is a federal district. There was a federal capital. He points out that a 10 by 10 square mile city is 4 times as large as London, and he thinks that's kind of big, especially because in federal districts, in addition to federal territories, federal Army and Navy bases, and federal ports. The Constitution doesn't regulate it at all, and they are outside of state regulation. And therefore, the president is essentially an authoritarian figure who can do whatever they want there. He does note that he understands that this came from the 1783 mutiny against the Continental Congress from the Pennsylvania line. He outright acknowledges that, but he also says we shouldn't probably freak out too much about that. It was 6 years ago, and we should be better off in the future. But he notes that giving the president this kind of power is extreme, and on top of that, if you're in a federal district, yeah, you pay federal taxes, but you don't pay state taxes. You're not in a state. And he was afraid that an authoritarian president, the wrong person in the future, after George Washington becomes president, they might abuse this power. And especially in ports, if you have a port in a big city and you look at the next harbor over and you're like, hey, we pay less taxes over here, you could coax people into wanting to join the federal territory or federal port or such. In doing so, these people would be giving up any constitutional rights they might have, though, of course, the Constitution doesn't provide a lot of rights. One of not just the federal farmer, but all of the Anti-Federalists' main argument for a Bill of Rights is that there were very little rights in the Constitution. But that aside, you have no constitutional protections in a federal district or territory. And that, to the federal farmer, was a very dangerous precedent to set. We just went through all 13 essays, observations, as he called them, of the federal farmer in just over 16 minutes. So I really rocked through them. Again, if you are interested in any of these ideas, I've both written and made videos about each and individual federal farmer. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to put out a poll in the next 2 days to see what we should start with next week. We've done Brutus, we've done Impartial Examiner, and now we've done the federal farmer. Who should we read next? Let me know in the comments. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, everywhere else. I will be putting out these polls everywhere I possibly can. And if you want to support the channel and this content, check out my Patreon page with the link down in the description below. I offer a bunch of extra stuff over there. Thank you so much to the people who are Patriots over on Patreon. And I will be back with another Founder for you tomorrow.